Bueno de Mesquita. Welcome aboard Bendiksen Airways.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did.
That's a good start.
It's unusual to
Okay.
get it right.
Yeah. How would you describe the state of the world when it comes to conflict at the moment?
Well, clearly the world is in disarray. The world is facing, in my view, conflicts that, but let me back up a little bit. Many, many years ago, in 1992, I wrote a book with a colleague called War and Reason. And in that book, it's a game theory book, we provide the necessary and sufficient conditions for war. Um, well, the war against Iran does not satisfy those conditions. The Israeli war against Gaza initially did, but the conduct of the war has deviated from what was necessary. Um, so that's problematic. The Russian invasion of Ukraine did not meet those conditions, so that clearly was
What
inappropriate.
are the main conditions?
Well, they're very simple. War is always costlier than reaching a negotiated agreement. There's, for instance, a result produced by somebody named James Fearon. War is always inefficient after the fact because beforehand, if you knew how a war was going to turn out, you could have made the same agreement at the beginning and avoided all of the dead people and all of the destroyed property and so forth, all the disruption. So, when does it make sense to wage war? Well, the main situation is what's called a commitment problem. I promise that I'm going to cooperate with you, but you have no reason to believe me because it's not in my interest to cooperate with you. So, in that circumstance, if you fear that I'm going to attack you, it makes sense. That is, I'm going to take advantage of you in some way, not necessarily attack. And I think that that gives you a big advantage. Then it pays for me to act first because I want to avoid giving you that big advantage. I want to pick where the fighting takes place, when it takes place, how intensely, and so forth. Well, the United States certainly had no reason to believe that Iran would gain a big advantage over the United States if Iran moved first. Russia had no reason, and we had no reason to believe that Iran was going to move first, that they were going to do anything. Vladimir Putin had no reason to believe that Ukraine was a threat to Russia. So these were wars of choice, not wars dictated by strategic calculations that a negotiation results in something horrible for me. And if I wait, I give the other side a big advantage. So it's not giving the other side the big advantage that really is essential, coupled with commitment that I believe that if I try to, I have a commitment problem. If I think I'm in negotiating with the other side, they will take advantage to get a first strike advantage. Well, the United States and the Iranian governments were negotiating before the war began on February 28th. It looked like the Iranian government was feeling enough pressure to make concessions, but Mr. Trump decided that he couldn't afford to wait, and so this has created a very disrupted world.
We dig deeper into this disruptive world. How would you introduce yourself?
How would I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Well, I'm a professor of politics at New York University. I'm retired as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And I am somebody who tries to understand politics through logic and evidence and not through opinion or personal preferences. And I have spent my academic career doing that, and I built a consulting business starting in 1981 or 82, a long time ago, um, that applied game theory models I designed to solve fundamental problems for governments, for corporations, and for some NGOs, in each case by working out how they could optimally negotiate a solution to the problems that they were facing, optimally from their point of view. That's what I do. That's what I have spent a million years doing.
How come you became interested in this?
Well, when I was a graduate student and started graduate school, I'm very old, in 1967. I took a course in which every student had to do an oral presentation on a book. And for reasons that have nothing to do with the content of the book I chose a book called The Theory of Political Coalitions by William Riker. It happens that that is the first game theory book in political science ever. And when I read that book, Riker purported to prove three results. By prove, I mean mathematically. And the middle result had an error in his proof. And I fixed the error, and I became very excited by the realization. I had gone to grad school to study India, not to do any of this. But I became excited by the realization that, contrary to what I had believed to that moment, you could talk about politics in terms of what is true and what is false, as opposed to what I like and what I don't like. And so I was hooked. I thought this was the way to study politics. And I had the good fortune that when I finished graduate school, I had a job for 2 years at Michigan State University, and then William Riker hired me in the department that he ran at the University of Rochester, where mathematical political science originated. And I had the good fortune that I could combine it with my interest at the time in India, because India had a lot of coalition governments, and so I could build theory about that. And here I am.
And how would you say your worldview and its workings has changed during your career?
So it's changed in fundamental ways. Uh, when I started out, my first job was as a professor of international relations. That's been my job ever since. The way people thought about international relations is they thought about things like, what is the national interest? And then what do states do to promote that interest? And how does the balance of power affect them and so forth? And I concluded very, very, very early in my career that that way of thinking was fundamentally flawed and could not provide helpful answers. And so I thought about, how is it flawed and how do we fix those flaws? And what does that tell us about how to study politics? So I don't know how much detail you want, but the idea of a national interest implicitly means that we can know what is what is good for social welfare. And there is a theorem by Kenneth Arrow, who's Nobel laureate in economics, died a few years ago in his mid-90s, a brilliant man, in which he said, okay, let's think about what rules a society should have to translate what people want into social welfare. And so he said, well, there are a few very basic conditions for the translation to be a fair translation, a meaningful translation. People should be free to want whatever they want. You may like vanilla ice cream better than chocolate. I may like chocolate better than vanilla. Society shouldn't tell me I have to like one better than the other. Call that universal domain. Society's preferences should be transitive. If a majority of people like choice A better than choice B, and a majority like choice B better than choice C, then a majority should like A better than C. He said he had what he called a unanimity principle. If everybody likes choice A better than choice B, society should not choose choice B. And finally, he had what he called indifference to irrelevant alternatives. If a majority likes A better than B, the introduction of C, another choice, into the mix shouldn't result in B being chosen. And then what he did is he showed that it is impossible, it's called an impossibility theorem, it is impossible to design a rule for adding up people's preferences that is guaranteed not to violate at least one of those conditions. So, when we talk about social welfare or the national interest, this is a constructed idea that does not follow logically from at least Arrow's fairness conditions. That means, well, where does it come from? The politician defines what he or she thinks will be good for them and then sells it to society. So when I teach this material at the very beginning of my course on international relations, I ask my students, I will ask you, if two-thirds of society would like to, for example, have free trade, is it possible that two-thirds of the same society, without tricking anybody, without changing anybody's mind, would support having trade protection? If two-thirds favor free trade, can two-thirds favor trade protection? It would seem not, wouldn't it? And yet, if you have a piece of paper, if you want to draw a picture, I can show you how easily we can achieve that. So all we have to do is say that we have to choose policies in two dimensions instead of one. So an x-axis and a y-axis. So maybe I have people who are happy with what they have on trade, but they want to spend more on defense. And I have people who want to be protected from foreign competition. They don't want free trade, and they're happy with what's being spent on defense. And I have people who want free trade and they want to spend more on defense. Or I could take any mix of these. Then I can get two-thirds for anything. So because they overlap, I get petals. So I realized talking about the national interest in the state made no sense, and that drove me to focus on what do leaders want. And I came to the conclusion that what leaders want is to come to power and to stay in power. And then conditional on being in power, they want as much discretionary control over how government revenue is used as they can get. Not the national interest, not balance of power. All of that is much less important than what leaders choose to do that will help them stay in power. But we see right now, Benjamin Netanyahu is facing this exact tension. On the one hand, he has an election coming up, and the Israeli electorate is not very happy with him right now, but they were very supportive of his war against Gaza. The international community wants him to make some sort of accommodation with the Palestinians. If he satisfies the international community, Israel will have more support in the world and so forth, but he will for sure not get reelected because the Israeli people don't want to do that. If he satisfies the Israelis and continues a very harsh approach to the Palestinians, the international community will give him difficulty, but he will get reelected. or I mean, he's not the Iran wars has pretty much made that unlikely. But had he not had the Iran war, he probably would have been. So this is a fundamental tension. He has to figure out, how do I sort out the coalitions to get to stay in power and to control how revenue is used, what policies are pursued, and so forth. Now that's where I wound up. That's where I am now.
Was that, or did that take you to the Selectorate Theory?
Yes, exactly. So the Selectorate Theory uh, starts from the very simple foundation that the way people have looked at international um, and so what I tried to do with colleagues was to build a theory that didn't start from the assumption that states have policies, because states don't have preferences, people do. And then, so the leader may want to do what's good for society, but what if what's good for society is bad for the leader? We don't see Kim Jong-un, for example, sacrificing his personal wealth and comfort to make the North Korean people better off. So I thought about, okay, what are the trade-offs that individual leaders face, not what does the society want? And that took me to, with colleagues, to Selectorate Theory. And Selectorate Theory basically says every organization, not just every government, every organization is, broadly speaking, divided into a small set of groups of people. There are the disenfranchised, those who have no say, not even a nominal say, in choosing leaders. There is the selectorate, those who have a say in picking leaders. So, for example, in the United States, it's all adults, everybody 18 years old and over who is a citizen of the United States. In Saudi Arabia, when it's time to pick a king, it's the royal family. In China, it's a part of the Communist Party, really down to the Central Committee. So this can be, the set that has a say can be very large, it can be very small, it can be anywhere in between. Then within that set, how many do you have to have? Not how many do you have, but how many do you have to stay in power? So, for example, in a two-party race in Britain, to be prime minister, you need to win half the seats in parliament plus one. And you need to win each of those seats by half the vote plus one. So ignoring the plus one to make the math easy, you need 25% of the vote properly placed. 75% could have voted the other way, and you could control the government if they were placed just right. In the United States, you can control the government with slightly under 20% of the vote, because of the electoral college distortion, if you place the votes just right. In Germany, you need much closer to, because they have proportional representation in each of the Länder from a list. So you need, it turns out, to win, you need very close to a majority. In China, at the moment, Xi Jinping needs the support, in a country of 1.5 billion people, he needs the support of 7 individuals in the Central Committee. So the size of what we call the winning coalition is highly variable. So we have the disenfranchised, the selectorate, and the winning coalition. It turns out that, as a matter of not very hard logic, you can explain a tremendous amount of what happens in politics, whether it's war and peace, or it's domestic policy, or it's corporate policy, just by knowing the size of those groups. And you could get a lot more leverage if you also know how expensive or how efficiently the society produces public goods. Because leaders in the selectorate theory do very few things. They come to power, they raise revenue. They may do that through taxation, they may do it through tariffs, they may do it through fees, but they raise revenue. They want to keep as much of that revenue for themselves, for their own discretionary use as they can. What decides how much they have to spend? Somebody's trying always to take their job. There is always somebody who wants to replace the Prime Minister of Norway. There is always somebody who wants to replace the President of the United States. There is somebody always who wants to replace the leader of Russia or China or Vietnam or what have you. Okay, so when you're in power, you have to spend your money in a way that ensures that the challenger, putting aside the details of revolution and coup, that the challenger doesn't win. Okay, how do you do that? So leaders spend money on two things. They spend money on public goods that are intended to benefit everybody: healthcare, education, defense policy, infrastructure, so on. And they spend money on private goods, you might call it corruption, for the members of their winning coalition. Now, how much they have to spend on corruption versus public goods is dictated by two things. How big is the coalition, and how expensive are public goods? Let's put aside for the moment how expensive or cheap it is for you to produce public goods. Stick with just the coalition, because I can show this to be in a trivially mathematically easy way that will explain almost all of the distribution of corruption in the world. All we have to do is say, okay, I have revenue. That's my constraint. I can't spend more than revenue, so I have a budget constraint. I'm spending it on public goods that come at a price of P, and on private goods that come at an implicit price of the size of the winning coalition. When the coalition is bigger, corruption opportunities are more expensive. If I only have to give the opportunities to a small number of people, they're much cheaper. Okay, if I just rearrange, so R, revenue, is greater than or equal to PG, G is public goods, plus WZ, Z is private goods. I just rearrange that. R minus PG divided by W is at least as big as Z. That's an identical statement. So now we're looking at a fraction, R minus PG over W. What happens to a fraction when the denominator gets bigger? The fraction gets smaller. So when I'm a democracy, I have a very big coalition. I have a lot less corruption. When I'm Xi Jinping in a country where I need the support of 7 people, when the denominator gets to be really small, I have a lot of corruption. That trivial equation alone explains about 70% of the variation across the world in how corrupt governments are estimated to be. It's just that simple. Okay, this has a very big consequence. So the leader has to spend more the bigger the coalition is, because the bigger the coalition gets to be, the more confident that a member is that even if they defect to a rival, the rival will put them in the winning coalition because they need a lot of people. But if the rival only needs a few people, it's very risky to defect to a challenger because they may not need you. So you are more loyal to the incumbent when the coalition is small, that is, when you're in a dictatorship, in an authoritarian regime. And that means that how much the leader gets to keep is shrinking as the coalition gets bigger. So the leader's welfare is strictly decreasing as the coalition on which the leader depends gets to be bigger. Leaders get to steal proportionately, relative to revenue, less money in democracies than in dictatorships. It's more lucrative to be Mohammed bin Salman or Kim Jong-un than it is even to be Donald Trump. And
before you continue, on Trump there, if I understand it correctly, his coalition, or what you call it, is probably the most corrupt in US history, or that's what I
absolutely,
hear.
Yes.
How does he kind of circumvent having a big coalition and still
Give
a
me a
lot of
minute. That's where I'm
corruption?
going. Give me a minute. I'm going to
All
show you.
right, go.
So the people, you have to produce more public goods as the coalition gets bigger because private goods get to be too expensive. So the people are strictly better off as the coalition gets bigger. What's the welfare of coalition members as it increases? Ah, this is a complex function. So it looks like the Nike swoosh curve, just like this. If you put your thumb and your index finger out, let me explain why. When the coalition is very small, the individuals in it are getting lots of private goods, lots of corruption opportunities. They're getting rich. Every time the leader makes that coalition bigger, that wealth, those corruption opportunities are being diluted among more people. So their welfare starts to go down. The leader has to compensate for that because otherwise they might defect. So the leader starts to spend more revenue on the coalition, leaving less for the leader. And as that coalition gets bigger and the leader so diluting the private goods, the leader is shifting gradually away from corruption opportunities to public goods because the price of corruption opportunities is going up as it gets bigger. Eventually it bottoms out and the function turns up as the coalition keeps getting bigger, dominated more and more by public goods rather than private goods. This has an important consequence, which is very important for Donald Trump. So let me first make a distinction on the price of public goods. In the United States, Norway produce public goods very efficiently. So this slope is steep. If you don't produce public goods efficiently, then the mathematics tells us the slope is less steep. Also, the minima occurs later. India doesn't produce public goods efficiently. So it has a big coalition, but it's much flatter. Let's look at places like most of Western Europe and the United States where they produce public goods efficiently. Notice that there is a point when the coalition is bigger, when you produce public goods efficiently, at which the coalition is as well off with a big coalition as they would have been if they were in the smallest possible coalition. They reach the local maxima. And past that point, as the coalition gets bigger, they can only be made better off by the government becoming more accountable, not less accountable. Now, that's bad for leaders. It's very good for society and it's good for the coalition. But if they're not efficient, that in producing public goods, that cut point comes very late. So there are many more. When it comes late, everything in this bowl below that point is the world of coups and revolutions. That's where you can have coups and revolutions. Okay, so what Donald Trump would like to do is shrink the coalition so he gets into the world where his welfare goes up and everybody else's if this theory is right, would have to go down. Here is his problem. In logic, you can't make enough people better off to support you when the coalition shrinks that you succeed because you're past this point. You're only better off this going up. No country, none, zero countries. I have data for over 200 years. No country that has passed, we can measure it, or has passed that point, has ever voluntarily stopped being democratic. The only countries that had passed that point, that stopped being democratic, were the European countries defeated by Nazi Germany in the 1940s. And as soon as Nazi Germany was defeated itself, each of those countries returned to being a large coalition democratic society. Because you cannot serve the interests of enough people to back you. So Donald Trump, every leader would like to shrink their winning coalition. Every leader, because they get more when the coalition is smaller. I go back to the emphasis that I started with. It's not about national interest. The problem that Democratic leaders have is that to stay in power, they have to satisfy very large numbers of people. So they look as if they are doing what's good for society, but they're doing it because it lets them stay in power. When the coalition is smaller, when it's more autocratic, less democratic society, they don't do that. They're all trying to do what keeps them in power and is good for them. That's what Donald Trump is trying to do. He faces, however, if this is right, a severe constraint. And indeed, it looks like he's going to try to rig the midterm election in November. And it also looks like he is likely to fail at that because states are organizing and all sorts of other groups of people are organizing to prevent him from stealing the election. He tried to overthrow the government in 2020. He failed. In a country that in 2020 was about 340 million people, he got the support of a few thousand who actually came out to demonstrate. It was not, it was a horrible event, but in terms of numbers, it was trivial. So I believe Donald Trump's ambition to remain in power will fail because the logic is against him, not because I don't like him or because other people don't like him, but because not enough people will benefit from what he wants to do to support him.
So if I understand you correctly, you say no democratic society or country has voluntarily become a autocratic country.
No democratic country that passed this point.
Okay.
Places like India are sliding towards autocracy, but they have a very flat slope. So the coalition doesn't gain much by increasing its size in terms of welfare. They're better off if they gamble on being out of it, but they get a lot if they can shrink it. Yeah, so no country that is past that point.
Do you think it's possible to become a leader of a country, democratic or not, and what should I say, keep your values? And how important is the personality of the leader, not becoming corrupt?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So there is one segment which we haven't talked about in selector theory where the leader's personality matters. But it's a relatively small segment, and it doesn't apply very much to democracy. I'll explain why in a moment. But first, let me explain what it is. So remember, I said leaders want to stay in power, and they want to have as much control over revenue as possible. Democratic leaders have relatively little control over revenue. Even Donald Trump, he has corruptly made a couple of $1 billion in the past year. The American economy is 30 some odd $1 trillion. Even what he has extracted through using his power, though it's awful and unprecedented in American history, it's a very small amount of money relative to the economy. Vladimir Putin is estimated to be worth $200 billion. Xi Jinping's family worth much more than Donald Trump's. Anyway, when the coalition is very big, you have very little discretion. So you're locked in. Your personality tells you you want to steal, but there's a limit. When the coalition is small, there's a lot of discretionary money. So you could be Xi Jinping, you could be Deng Xiaoping, you could be Lee Kuan Yew, you could be Kwame Nkrumah, you could be Kim Jong-un, you could be Mobutu Sese Seko. These guys use that discretionary money differently. So I divide that set of people, the smaller coalition leaders who have a lot of discretionary money, into three bundles. There are thieves, call them the Hall, Haul, of shame. These are just people who say, oh, I can steal a lot of money. I'm going to make myself rich. Mobutu made himself rich Ferdinand Marcos made himself rich. Kim Jong-un and his father and his grandfather before made themselves very rich. But there are two other bundles. There are civic-minded leaders, dictators, who are interested in making society, changing society for what they see as better. I believe to a significant degree that was true, for example, of Mao Zedong. It was, I believe, true of Kwame Nkrumah, who was in Ghana, or Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. So those three people that I just mentioned are well-intentioned. They didn't steal huge amounts of money, but they were stupid. That is, they had, so here's personality. They had very bad ideas about how to make society better off, and they didn't adjust their ideas as they saw them fail. Uh, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution to ensure that he stayed in power. It led to famine, and the Great Leap Forward before that. It led to famine, deaths of tens of millions of people from starvation, but he didn't want to lose face. He wouldn't change the policy. This is just bad idea. Then there are people like Lee Kuan Yew, ran Singapore. Deng Xiaoping was brought back from exile in China exactly for the very economic ideas that got him sent into exile. That is, that the Chinese should move to a more market-oriented economy, fewer communes, less state ownership that would incentivize people to produce, and China's incomes began to skyrocket relative to what they had been. So he's in the bundle of what my co-authors and I call the Hall of Fame. That is, they meant well and they did well. Kwame Nkrumah thought countries could only become prosperous if they had heavy industry. So in a country whose comparative economic advantage was in the production, for example, of cocoa, he tried to build steel mills. Just not a good idea. So their personality may matter. I have no explanation of what makes one leader want to steal the money and makes another leader civic-minded and makes some civic-minded leaders responsive to their errors and adjust and others not. But beyond that, the selectorate theory doesn't say that personality doesn't matter. It doesn't say that culture doesn't matter. It does say that those things don't matter nearly as much as people think, because we are explaining very large amounts of variation in outcomes without any of those things taken into account.
Well, with everything you said and your theory as a backbone, would you say that, especially in democracies, would you say that elections and democracies in general give us a genuine control over policy, or mainly an illusion?
Well, I wouldn't call it an illusion. I would say that what democracy provides, mindful of Arrow's theorem, is the cheap and easy way to throw the rascals out. So, on balance, you get better policies more in keeping with what a lot of people want, because otherwise you get voted out of office. So leaders want to do what's good for them, but in the selectorate theory, what they want that's good for them is to stay in power and control revenue. Ideology is not really important in selectorate theory. So it's not that they're not true to their beliefs. Their belief is, how do I get to power? People who are not interested in power in democracies don't seek office. Or if they do, they don't stay in office long if they don't adjust to, here's what I need to do to stay in power. So the ability to throw the rascals out without a war means that leaders try to do what's good for society as they understand it. And it means that if they made the choices that society at the moment that a lot of people didn't agree with, they get voted out. And it's pretty straightforward. In fact, Alastair Smith and I, my co-author, we're writing a paper at the moment asking about income growth and what produces income growth. And we start from a very simple perspective. There are basically four models of how to run societies. Xi Jinping has expressed what he calls the China model of modernization. You need education. If you educate society, you will do well. Lee Kuan Yew introduced an alternative model in Singapore, which some other countries adopted. And his view was, as is the view in China, democracy leads to redistribution. It doesn't lead to growth. It leads to fickle policies because they throw the rascals out and you don't know what the right policy is. And so the way to get growth is a lot of education and rule of law. The Western model, the model that Norway follows, that Britain follows, that France follows, that Denmark follows, that Italy follows, that the United States follows, that Australia follows, that Japan follows, the Republic of Korea follows, says, well, you need three elements. You need education, you need rule of law, and you need democratic choice. Selectorate theory modifies that to you need a big coalition and low price for public goods. Okay. And then there's a large, in the history of the world, the vast majority of governments that didn't pursue education, didn't pursue rule of law, and didn't pursue representing the interests of the citizens through democracy. So what we are finding is the Chinese model and the Singapore model are terrific at leaders staying in power. And following none of these models is even better. The Western model is terrible at keeping people in power, but the Western model is much better at producing economic success. So, but part of what's motivating this study is what I view as a mistaken understanding of what China has or has not accomplished. I'm going to pose a question to you, if you don't mind. China today is the second largest economy in the world. What was the second largest economy in the world in 1900? Sorry? It was China. Your sound has cut out.
Do you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I hear you now.
Yeah. No, I don't. China. Okay.
China was second or first largest in 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, and 1900, trading places with India. When you have enough people, even though they're dirt poor, the gross economy can be very large. The interesting question about China is, how did China manage between 100 and 1960 to go from second largest to sixth? How did it fall that far with such a huge population? And the answer is that much of the world democratized. And much of the world introduced, the Western world introduced compulsory education. There was almost no compulsory education in Europe before 1920. China didn't introduce compulsory education through ninth grade until 1986. Okay, let me make another observation about how people misunderstand what China has done. In 1980, approximately, Deng Xiaoping's changed policies began to show effects. And per capita income in China grew by 10%. Whereas, per capita incomes in the United States were growing by maybe 2%. Indeed, between 1960 and a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, China's per capita income had grown by like 47 times. Certainly not true in the West. People think that's a miracle, it's remarkable, and it is fantastic. So let me ask you a question. By how much has China narrowed the gap in per capita income with Western Europe or the United States or Taiwan in the last 40 years?
10%.
Is not narrowed it. The gap in per capita income is increased. They're farther behind, not closer. You can have 10% growth when the denominator is near zero. Per capita income in China in 1980, according to the World Bank, was around $400. So a 10% growth meant people had $40 more in their pocket. That was a lot of money for somebody in China who was earning $400, but you would not have noticed that increase in your income. So what's happened when we look at growth rates, we're comparing countries whose denominators are radically different. It's a meaningless comparison. When you go to the grocery store, they don't ask what percentage more money do you have this year than you had last year? They ask you, do you have enough money to pay the bill? So if we look at change in per capita income rather than percentage change, China and the countries following the China model are falling farther and farther behind. They are not narrowing the gap. Per capita income in Taiwan and in China were very similar from 1820 to 1960. In the 1960s, 20 years ahead of China, Taiwan introduced compulsory education. And in the 1980s, they introduced democracy. And since then, the Chinese economy goes up like this and the Taiwanese economy like that. They're pulling farther and farther ahead. The average American today is making something, I don't have the exact number in my head, but the difference in their per capita income compared to what it was in 1980 is about $60,000 more. People are looking at because they look at numbers that are politically motivated instead of that are what is the logic of income, because growth rates taper. China's growth rate is much lower now than it was when the denominator was $400. You have to look at change in income, not growth rates.
Why
So
are these numbers and the way you explain it not coming forward in the media?
that's a wonderful question. Because I wrote a popular version of what I just described to you, and I sent it to several different outlets that popular media and places where I have good contacts where they know me, and they didn't want to touch it. And I believe it's because it's politically awkward to be saying, by the way, the West is pulling ahead of China, not falling behind. And I'm not using obscure numbers. I'm using World Bank. This is the standard. This is the numbers the Chinese government uses. It's just people became fixated on growth rates without thinking about what is the difference when you're dividing by a very small number compared to when you're dividing by a big number. When per capita income is $50,000, 10% growth takes a lot of increased income. When per capita income is $400, it's nothing. I don't know why, other than, I can only speculate. I don't understand why people were not, so I'm writing an academic version of this, why people in reading general interest works don't want to have this out there.
Democracies.
You have cut out.
Do you hear me now?
You're back. You're back now. Yep.
Democracies are often described as peace-loving, but still they go to war all the time, contrary to public opinion or public wishes. Why?
So democracies are not peace-loving. They're also not interested in promoting democracy. Uh, people have, again, these romanticized ideas of politics where their opinions substitute for rigorous logic. What does the selector theory tell us? The selector theory tells us leaders want to stay in power. Okay, let's think about what that means in foreign affairs. You are an adversary, and you have something I would like. I would like your policies to be compliant with mine. I would like you to let me have military bases or whatever it may be. I'm not happy with what you are doing. Your citizens don't vote in my elections. I don't care how happy or unhappy I make them. I want to make my voters happy. My voters don't like what you are doing. Okay, there are a couple of things I can do about that. I could come to you and I could say, you know, I would like you to change your policies to be the ones I like. You say, yes, well, that's very nice, but they're not good policies for me. And I say to you, well, I see you're a poor country. I'll give you money. We'll call it foreign aid, and you'll change your policies to do what I want. In fact, that is exactly how foreign aid works. So imagine that you are a democratic country, and I say to you, I'll give you foreign aid. Well, you have to worry about a lot of people at home. If you're an autocrat, you only have to bribe your few winning coalition members of the small coalition. Oh, more money divided among, say, 100 generals. Yeah, that's going to be great. They'll be very happy. They'll be very loyal to me. Oh, but I need 1 million votes. You have to give me a lot of money for me to adopt a policy my citizens don't like because I have to be able to provide so many new things for them that they will like. So democratic countries rarely get foreign aid. And when they get foreign aid, they get more per capita than autocrats because they're more expensive to bribe. Interestingly, by the same logic, rich autocrats get more foreign aid than poor autocrats. It's not about need. When you're rich, the marginal value of the next dollar is small. So I have to give you more dollars for the same policy concession than I would have had to give you if you had very little income. So poor countries are willing to sell out policy cheaply, richer countries more expensively. Okay, so one solution is I'll give you money. Well, suppose you are Iraq under Saddam Hussein or Iran under the Ayatollahs. Well, you have a lot of revenue from oil. So foreign aid's not going to do the trick. You can generate a lot of money on your own. So then war makes sense. Now, if I make you into a democracy, what policies will you follow? You'll follow the policies that your democratic voters favor. That's great if I happen to like those policies. But if I don't like those policies, I don't want you to be democratic. I want to impose a puppet who will do what I want. So in Venezuela, after Donald Trump overthrew Maduro, he didn't turn to the very strong, very well-organized democratic movement in Venezuela to build a new government. He took Maduro's vice president because she will, to stay in power, be compliant with American policy interests. So she can, I don't know how much money she steals, but I would guess it was a lot. It's efficient for her as well as for us. So there are really very few examples of democracies building democracy in other countries. That's just a romantic view.
Yeah. But if public opinion matters not so much, why do governments invest so heavily in shaping public narratives before and during wars?
I lost part of it. So if public opinion matters so much,
Yeah, if public opinion matters so little in many foreign policy decisions, why do governments invest so heavily in shaping public narratives during and before and during wars?
you misunderstand me. It doesn't matter very little. democratic leaders are pursuing the policies that they believe their constituents want, not the general public. So it's not general public opinion. It's the public opinion, if you're Donald Trump, of the MAGA crowd. That's who matters to him. So they are not ignoring public opinion. They are doing what will get them in power, and that means satisfying their constituents. So there's a very wonderful study by Helen Milner and Dustin Tingley, very subtle study of the voting record of members of the US Congress on foreign aid bills. They asked a very straightforward question. Does the proportion of the district's population, voters, citizens, that come from, have family in potential aid recipient countries affect how the member of Congress votes? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. If they have the more constituents they have who at the margin care about aid to Ghana or Nigeria or wherever it may be, the more likely that member of Congress is to vote for a foreign aid, to purchase policy concessions from those countries that will satisfy their constituents. So they're very responsive to public opinion. As I like to ask my students, how many of you favor helping the poor? Every hand goes up. And then I ask them, how many of you favor helping the poor around the world if it means a reduction in the aid you get for tuition from the federal government? Every hand goes down. So people are in favor of helping the poor. People are in favor of promoting democracy, except when it costs them something. Same with the environment. I ask my students, how many want to reduce global warming? Every hand goes up. How many of you spend an average of about $50 a month on cell phones? Every hand goes up. You know, 30 years ago, people spent nothing on cell phones because they didn't exist. How many of you are willing to give up half of your cell phone use so that money goes to improving the environment? Well, every hand goes down. Talk is cheap.
For sure. What about power behind the scenes and lobbying and money for campaigns, etc.? What do you think about that? And what do you think about removing private money from politics? And what would that actually change in government's behavior?
So this is a very hard question because the answer is much more complex than people generally realize. I have this conversation quite regularly with my wife. In principle, it would be great to remove money, private money, from politics. The Supreme Court recently ruled that you can't do that because it's free speech. Okay, here's the more subtle element. There's a lot of research into money in politics in the United States. I don't know about money in politics in Europe. So the research shows that contrary to what a lot of people believe, as I understand the research, the money in politics has relatively little effect on most electoral outcomes, and I'll explain the subtleties in a moment, and relatively little effect on policy. Why? So most in the United States, most congressional districts, for example, because they've already been gerrymandered, the outcome is pretty well known. So the money is not buying the outcome. What the money is buying is the hope to get access to the victor after the election. In competitive districts, the big money donors often give to both the Democrat and Republican candidate because it's a competitive district. They don't know who will win. And so they want to have fed money to both sides in the hope that they will then have access. So a consequence of that is, of course, that but the money is going. We are back. The money is going disproportionately to the candidate expected to win rather than shaping the outcome. Okay, so then after the fact, yes, so people who've given money have better access, but on controversial issues, there's also a lot of opposition. So if they haven't given in the secure places that oppose, the effect is much smaller than people believe. There is some research that says, well, but the cost is so low relative to the potential of return that it's worth the gamble. And it's a complicated literature, but mostly the big story is the money goes to the candidates that the donor thinks will win, as opposed to shaping who wins. So what's called a selection effect.
What about lobbying? As I understand it, there are a huge number of lobbyists in Washington at every moment.
Absolutely correct. But lobbyists have two problems. One, there's a huge number of them, so they're on every side of every issue. So it's not like all the lobbying is in one direction. So they're trying to countervail each other. The other, which I have encountered a great deal in my consulting life, um, lobbyists tend to spend their time and energy making sure that people they believe agree with them continue to agree with them. They spend very little time, money, and effort on people they believe disagree with them, trying to persuade them to change their behavior. So in my 40 some odd years as a consultant looking at results that involved lobbying, uh, they don't do a very good job of doing it because they're talking to the folks who agree with them instead of figuring out who might be pivotal that could be swung that doesn't agree with them. But I mean, lobbying is, all said, is an expression of preferences. Um, I don't have as big a problem with lobbyists as I do with campaign money. Uh, Unfortunately, from my point of view, after all, I'm not a lawyer, the Supreme Court seems to think that after many decades of believing that the Constitution said you could restrict outside money, that you can't restrict it.
What about what about a lot of leaders, governments hiding, or what should I say, behind classified intelligence that the public cannot see to maybe do what they like?
So I have, in my consulting life, done lots of classified work. And I have a mixed set of experiences. Some projects, of course, must be classified for security reasons. If you're trying to change a government, you don't want to announce to the world that you're doing that because there are countermaneuvers that the other side will take, which they won't have taken otherwise. But I have also seen lots of times where information is classified because it's inconvenient. It's politically not what an administration wants out there, or variations on that theme. And that's terrible. Now, I don't know very well how it works in other governments. I have done some classified work for other governments. But classification is very much a mixed bag. Some of it is absolutely necessary and legitimate. And some of it is to cover things up conveniently. And most of it is neither of those. Most of it is, well, people will take it seriously. That is, the executive will take it seriously if it's classified, and not so seriously if it's not classified. I'm going to give an example in broad outline. I did a project for the U.S. intelligence community. It's been publicly written about, so I can say what it was, about how to remove Ferdinand Marcos, this is a long time ago, from leadership in the Philippines and create a democratic government. And we succeeded. And the study I did was very highly classified. I was not allowed to read my own analysis after I wrote it, to edit it, because I was told, you are not the president, vice president, national security advisor, secretary of state, secretary of defense, or director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So that's only for their eyes. You can't read your study. Okay. But I teach an undergraduate upper level course called Solving Foreign Crises. And around that same time, I had my undergraduate students generate a data set on very similar questions to the questions I was addressing with regard to Marcos. And they, of course, only had access to public sources. The internet wasn't even very good at that time. So, they were looking at major newspapers and extracting the data that my modeling required. They got exactly the same result. They got exactly the same answer. It was classified so that the president would think, oh, this is really, really subtle and important, whereas undergraduates could produce the same result. Because the only data I needed is who's trying to influence the decision, how much do they care about it, what outcome do they currently say they want, how influential could they be if they tried as hard as they can, how open are they to listening to other arguments. This is public information. This is not a secret. I didn't need secrets. But there's a lot of panache in saying something is classified. That to me is the biggest reason, or the biggest abuse of classification, is to say to the leaders who will digest it, oh, I should pay very careful attention. Nobody else knows this.
My impression that a lot of people in a lot of countries view the US as arrogant and they can do what they like. How do you view the principle that what kind of right does a nation have to intervene in other nations' affairs?
Well, I'm not in the world of rights in that sense because I'm not a lawyer. So I'll answer that a little bit differently. Go-it-alone foreign policies rarely work. So, I gave a TED talk in 2009 in which I used the modeling that I've developed to predict whether and when Iran would build a nuclear weapon. This talk was, I think, in February 2009, and I predicted, I think, through 2014. And I concluded that Iran was not going to build a nuclear weapon in that span of time. Recently, I'm just writing a book on how that model works. In one of the, maybe in the last chapter, I went back to those data, not updated. So it's information as of 2009. And I did a set of simulations. What if under the conditions of that time, which we could think of as not that different from today, the United States, I gave it 4 different ways to approach negotiations with Iran. The US could go alone and say Iran should have absolutely no right to enrich uranium. That's the approach that Donald Trump has taken. I simulated the United States could collaborate with the NATO allies to say Iran can not enrich uranium. I simulated the US goes alone, but says what was in 2009 the Russian position. Iran can enrich for civilian nuclear energy, but no further than that. The US works with the NATO allies and takes the position Iran can enrich for civilian nuclear energy and no farther than that. What do I find? In the 2 cases where the US goes alone, the results are, in the case where the US goes alone, no enrichment is the only case of those 4 where in the simulations, Iran builds a nuclear weapon. In the case where the US goes alone but says they can enrich for civilian nuclear energy, as I predicted back in 2009, they make a research quantity of weapons-grade fuel to sustain the ability to go nuclear, but don't go nuclear. In the 2 models where the US cooperates with the NATO allies in negotiating, Iran agrees to only have civilian nuclear energy. So clearly, this is not opinion. It's just mathematics. The math does not change. I only change the structure of the inputs to set up these different scenarios. And there's the answer. Now, this model is according to a declassified CIA study, accurate well over 90% of the time. Of course, we want to update the data and all of that. So I don't stand by this, but I simply emphasize it's almost always the case that if you build a coalition to adopt a position that a group can agree to, you bring a lot more leverage to the table than if you go alone. So my view is that Donald Trump and his team sadly don't understand foreign policy. They believe mistakenly, as I have emphasized, many people do, that foreign affairs might makes right, that it's about the balance of power and not about the balance of interests. And so he thinks, well, the United States has enormous power. And what he has discovered is that didn't work in Iran. It hasn't been hugely successful in Gaza either. And Mr. Putin presumably is learning the same thing in Ukraine. If you don't have people working with you, it's not only that you are bringing less power to the table, you're bringing less insight. You're bringing less subtle analytic work to the table to work out what's the right, who will listen to whom. Well, if I've got 20 people 20 countries that are willing to weigh in with different parties on the other side, somebody over here has influence with this guy, somebody over there has influence with that guy. I don't have that influence with everybody. Influence that is shaping people's incentives can be very personal. It's a terrible mistake to go alone. It's always a mistake to go alone.
How do you view the the balance here between lack of moral and a lack of competence in, for example, Donald Trump's case?
Well, not being a psychologist, not being into personality. So I'm now going to take off my academic hat for the moment. I view Donald Trump's choices as immoral, but I don't view the question of morality as a powerful matter in foreign affairs. Let me explain why. It's a conversation I have with my students when I teach solving foreign crises. Every dispute has parties on each side who think they have the moral high ground, that they are the ones who are correct. So that's not a very good sorting mechanism for how to solve a crisis. The good mechanism is, how do I incentivize somebody, enough people on the other side, to change their behavior because they believe it will be good for them to change their behavior? So I like to make the observation that I am very confident that in 1945, in August 1945, as Adolf Hitler sat in his bunker with a pistol against his temple, it did not ever cross his mind that he was not on the moral high ground, that he was not the good guy, but evil had won. And had he won the war, I wouldn't be here having this conversation with you, and the view of what was moral would be different. So in terms of competence, that we can evaluate quite straightforwardly. That doesn't have to be a matter of opinion. And in my view, the current U.S. foreign policy leadership is not competent. They don't know what they're doing because there's nobody at the political level, as opposed to the civil service level, who's a professional, knows how to think about these things. And Jared Kushner may be a good real estate business person. I have no idea. But he doesn't know anything about foreign affairs. He's learning on the job. Well, learning on the job is okay if you're sitting next to apprenticing to somebody who knows what they're doing and you're learning how they do it. But apprenticing by actually being on the front line of negotiating, whether with Saudi Arabia or with Bahrain or with Iran, you need people who have spent their lives learning how to do this, apprenticing behind people who knew how to do it, or having studied it carefully. So this is, I don't say that he's not competent. He's not competent in foreign affairs. He doesn't know about it. Same with Woodcock. He may be perfectly good real estate man. I don't know, but he doesn't know anything about how to negotiate a deal.
Just to stay on the morality, one more question there. My brother works in defense here in Norway, and he says that morality shouldn't have a place in geopolitics. Is that correct, and also is that uncomfortable to the average man?
Well, I myself am not comfortable with whether it should or shouldn't, because what is moral is in the eyes of the beholder. I return
But
to
are
what
there no
Adolf Hitler thought
universal
he was
moral?
moral.
Shouldn't there be some universal moral truths?
There should be, but are there?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
I'm all for there should be, but are there? I go back to Arrow's theorem. You may have a view of what is morally right in the world, and I may have a view of what is morally right in the world, and a third person may have a view. The likelihood that we have the same exact view, alas, is not very high. So I'm not uncomfortable with your brother's view that I would rephrase it as it shouldn't to instead it doesn't, because sides have interests. This is why I focus on leaders and not states, The United States doesn't have a defined interest. Norway does not have a defined interest. Your view of what is good for Norway and your brother's view of what is good for Norway maybe overlap, but not be identical. We don't know which one is right or if anyone is right. But we do know that there are strategies that are effective at altering what people do, and there are other strategies that are not. For example, when I teach solving foreign crises, the first several weeks, by the way, of the course are essentially curing students of they know what's right. Because they have a view of how a dispute should come out. And I explain to them that's not the same as it's the right view. And I give the example, Hitler had a view of how things should come out. So what I ask them to think about is, what does each side claim they want? Not what do they expect to get, but what do they claim they want? And how do you think about getting people to make the deal you want? And so I point out to them that a mistake many lawyers make. Lawyers don't like to put a number on the table in litigation, for example. And sometimes that's all right, and sometimes that's a mistake, because when you put a proposal on the table, whether it's about Gaza or it's about Ukraine or it's about a lawsuit, you are framing the agenda. You are defining a boundary in the agenda. So you want to pick what you ask for, not in terms of what you actually want, but strategically. In game theory terms, what's called an endogenous choice. What can I choose that will make the other person prefer to say yes rather than no? What is the minimum I have to give away to get the other person, for example, go back to your opening question, to negotiate with me rather than fight with me? There always exists such a proposal. So I teach my students how to calculate that proposal. And I then show them that that proposal is always, if done correctly, in the interest of the side making the concession, not just in the interest of the side getting some reduced demand, but in the interest of the side making the concession, that their expected payoff is bigger. They expect to get more than they would have gotten if they took a tougher stance. So that's, one might say that's not moral, because after all, you're not saying what you want. You're picking what you think you can get. Bluffing is often seen as immoral, but bluffing is, of course, a common strategy in foreign affairs. So what I try to teach students is how to work out what is the optimal pathway through a strategic problem that will get you the most you, in fact, can expect to get. And that's what I've done in my consulting life for 40 some odd years. And it's worked pretty well. We got Ferdinand Marcos to give up power. Got lots of other examples that I can't tell you, where there was nothing to do with it does to do with what we want, but how can I get what's the most I can get the other side to believe they will be better off doing than not doing at the lowest cost to me?
Staying on this, then I have a Canadian friend who it's kind of silly, but he says why can't we all just get along? If you zoom out on a broad perspective globally, is the only possibility to get along, is that a global government?
Global government would not lead people to get along. So I'm going to go back to the very opening of this conversation when I talked about William Riker's theory of political coalitions. I said there were three results. One was called the size principle, that you form as small a coalition as you need and no bigger, because you have to compensate people in the coalition. So if you make it bigger, it's less for you. Okay, so already we're not getting along because there are people we're going to leave out. His third result is what he called the disequilibrium principle. If we have a coalition of everybody, a global government, nobody gains, it falls apart. it's unstable. Because in fact, people don't want the same thing. This is the fundamental, one of, not the fundamental, it's one of the fundamental errors in Marx's theory. I don't talk about Marxism as an ideology, but rather Marxism as a theory. So Marxism starts from the assumption that everybody in the proletariat wants the same thing. Therefore, we should have a dictatorship of the proletariat because they're in agreement. And of course, by World War I, Lenin learned that the proletariat did not all want the same thing. Brits wanted to support the British government, and German workers wanted to support the German government, not each other. So global government, everybody getting along, assumes everybody has compatible interests. And it turns out that that's not true. So it seems to me what we need is governments that are accountable to many. That's what democracy is. No two democracies are alike in their structure. There's a reason for that. Governments are shaped at the time that they are shaped to serve the interests of the moment. Very few people are long-term maximizers. So, it would be great if everybody who agrees that the global environment needs to be changed would agree on long-term actions to improve it. The problem is those long-term actions are costly in the short term, and nobody wants to reach into their own pocket to pay for it. So automatically people have divergent interests. So any effort at govern the whole is essentially dictatorship if it is bound to fail because people will partition into factions that want different things.
Do you think that means that the EU will collapse, or is it a good?
I've written extensively on the EU, as a matter of fact. So a piece of the EU does really well, and much of the rest of the EU does not. So the EU was good, I'm going to be obnoxious, at emulating something that the American founding fathers stumbled on, because I don't think they understood how important it was going to be. And that is to make those within the Union, those within the states of the United States, a free trade zone. So we have the Commerce Clause that says you can't charge tariffs between the states. The EU, building on the coal and steel community, came to understand that restricting the ability to have internal tariffs was going to make a big economic difference. Now, in agriculture, it's a little bit more complicated, but by and large, that was the great insight of the EU. Will it collapse? No, because there's no need for it to collapse. The parliament doesn't really mean anything. So who will care other, the people who go to parliament, I'm sure enjoy it. But it doesn't do much. The structure, the community structure, requires unanimity. Unanimity essentially means no governance. So the individual constituent parts get to do things largely the way they want. I mean, after all, look at how Orban was able to stop the EU from giving the kind of aid to Ukraine that just about everybody else in the EU wanted. I mean, I thought, within a year of his first election, I thought that Hungary should be removed from the EU, but the EU doesn't have a ready mechanism for removal. So it doesn't need to collapse because the parliament's really of no consequence and not likely to become of consequence. That's already been attempted and failed. The euro, I'm not an economist. There are governments like the German government that are not thrilled about having to subsidize the inflationary tendencies of places like Italy or Spain, or a number of years ago, Greece. So how stable the euro is long term, I don't know enough economics to have a confident answer to that, but that's something I worry about all the time. Um, but the big picture, the trade, essentially free trade, free movement of people, free movement of labor, essentially, not totally. That's a big step towards improving the prospects of economic growth. And it's bounded by each individual government's ability to set its own policies. It's a confederation, not a federation. The United States started with a confederacy and got rid of it pretty quickly because the unanimity rule, which the U.S. Confederation had, is disastrous. Poland in the 1700s had a unanimity rule. The Russians looked at that and said, oh, well, they can't all agree. We'll just walk in. And they took over. So there are pieces that could be remodeled to work better, but they'd be hard to remodel because when you have a unanimity principle, uh, anybody can veto a change. And they can veto a change that doesn't help them locally. So the EU, I think, lumbers along.
So I guess the easiest way for people to get along is that most people are well off economically.
Yeah, prosperity is really a very good thing for making it easier for people to get along. Yeah, I mean, of course, they always feel relative deprivation, but the average European has a very good life,
Yeah.
and so the squabbles that arise relative to the sorts of things that arise in non-democratic countries are pretty minor stuff to fight about.
Before we wrap up, if you were to predict, and let's not go long term, but let's say 2, 3 years, how do you view the current conflicts ending?
So I think the Ukraine conflict um, will will end with Russia uh, holding on to pieces of East Ukraine, maybe not as much as they have now. They'll hold Crimea, um, and if I were designing an outcome, I would be going back to the agreement in the 1990s when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of sovereignty, and I would bolster that. So if I were the European Union, I would look, or if I were the German government, the French government, the British government, maybe the Dutch, maybe the Norwegians, um, Swedes, maybe the Danes, I would put 20,000 troops in Ukraine permanently as a tripwire so that because any agreement that Putin makes is not a credible agreement. That is, if he saw an opening to alter it for his advantage, he would. Now, he won't live forever, but he seems, we hear rumors that he has Parkinson's and so forth. He hides a hand that looks like it may be trembling, but he also shows off bare chest, see how healthy I am. He's probably got a number of years to go. Um, I'm reasonably optimistic that the cost to him politically and to Russia of continuing the war is becoming excessive because what's happening is Europe is now starting to put real money behind Ukraine now that Orban is gone. Um, and even the Trump administration is starting to talk about putting some real resources in again. Gaza, plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. Both sides have made bad decisions for decades. I am not somebody who puts all the blame on one side. Uh, both sides have, it's worked really, let me be very clear here. The, the situation has worked really well for Israeli leaders, not for society. And until very recently, it worked really well for the leaders of Hamas and before them, the PFLP. So they got to stay in power for a long time. They got to take a lot of resources and so forth. For the average Palestinian, it's a horror. Per capita income in Palestine is about 1/10 of what it is in Israel. And that's not just the fault of the Israelis. That's the fault of both sides. Billions of dollars have flowed into uh, Gaza and the Palestinian Authority. And where has that money gone? It's gone into the pockets of the leaders and into tunnels and weapons and not into improving the lives of the citizens. So unfortunately, I don't see much change for that. I wrote a paper, I think in 1976, on how to make a lasting peace in the Middle East. I stand by the fundamental claim. If I were the Israeli government, if I were advising the Israeli government, if they were listening to my advice, I would wake up tomorrow morning and say, today we declare Palestine to be an independent state. And we are happy to help them if they will abide by international law and so forth. We will give them foreign aid if they abide by the kinds of policies that we would like to see between us. And if they don't want to have our help, that's fine. That's their business, but they should understand under international law, if they fire rockets at us as a sovereign state, we will defend ourselves and crush them. So up to you. So now it's up to the people in Palestine to decide who's the enemy. Is it the internal guys? Is it the external guys? Who do I put the pressure on? And how do I get a government that advances my interests? And I think I know how to design that. But Mr. Netanyahu is not going to do that, because if he announced tomorrow morning that Palestine is independent, the religious parties on his right would abandon him and he would no longer be prime minister. Iran, it's a very hard problem because the Iranians have come to understand, thanks to incompetence on the side of the United States, that they can control the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States military is coming to understand that it's not affordable to throw missiles at drones. That spending $1 million and more a pop to take down a $30,000 drone, it's not a good trade-off. So there will be, and we're going to turn to the Ukrainians to understand how to make better drone defenses, and to our own scientists. And so that will shift. So somewhere a few years down the road, the Strait of Hormuz will be open. But in the short term, that's problematic. Those are my guesses, not analytically based. So,
Final question then. You've already lived a long life. What is the meaning of it all?
well, for me, the meaning of life is really two things: seeing my children and my grandchildren build successful lives, and trying to change how we think about and understand politics so that it is done as a science instead of as opinion and wisdom. That's when you're dead, you're dead. And the meaning of life is whatever you make of the time that you are alive, doing whatever it is that gives you pleasure, that things that have given me the most pleasure are family and research and teaching. I love to teach as well. That's why I'm still teaching.
Thank you for the education.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.